What I'd like to do is just use the time to introduce a project, a larger project, and try and say something about it and the motivations for it, and try and generate some questions about it. I'm not going to talk about birth, although I have been present at 2 births, well 3 I suppose if you count my own. I'm not even going to talk about death. What I'm interested in is what I'm calling the interval at the end of a life. And I'd like to try and clarify that notion. There's a sense in which, of course, it's an achievement of medical science that a life is now extended in ways that were just unimaginable even a few decades ago. And it's extraordinary if you just look at the amount of money that's spent of the medical budget just on the final stages of a life. There's been a very interesting, and I think it'll be quite an influential book recently by Atul Gawande called Being Mortal, Illness, Medicine and What Matters at the End. And he makes the point that it's medical science that's made it possible for a life to be extended in this fashion. But the question that arises when we think about the way in which it's been extended, namely, how should we live when we are dying? Because we're now dying, as it were, across years in a very different way to the way we perhaps once were, is not a question that can be answered medically. Okay, so we're indebted to medical science for, as it were, making us aware of a period of our life, or making a period of a life possible in a way it wasn't before. But medicine can't help, as it were, resolve the issue of what we want to say about that period, or how we should think about it or handle it. So if we take this question, how should we live now when we are dying? Gawande says that in the past, when dying was typically a more precipitous process, we did not have to think about a question like this. Though some diseases and conditions had a drawn-out natural history, without the intervention of modern medicine, with its scans to diagnose problems early and its treatments to extend life, the interval between recognizing that you had a life-threatening ailment and dying was commonly a matter of days or weeks. So it's that, happily, I had this phrase, the interval at the end of a life, long before I read this book, but it's this phrase, the interval between recognizing that you had a life-threatening ailment and dying, this interval that I'm interested in. I'm interested in something like trying to do justice to what it is to live in this interval, or perhaps to live with someone who's living in this interval. Particularly in that latter case, learning to see and hear them differently. And I mean, this becomes most clearly to the fore in the case of dementia, in terms of my own experience of looking after someone suffering from this. There's an interesting way in which people often describe living with someone with long-term dementia or Alzheimer's or whatever, that it's a sort of grieving while the person's still there, and it captures something quite profound about the experience. But what it perhaps misses, although it perhaps gets to a psychological truth about the person who's, as it were, suffering with the loved one, or the person who has the dementia, it doesn't perhaps get to the truth of what that person is undergoing, because that person is still here, still there, still alive. So I'm really interested in this notion of this interval, but there's a tension, because on the one hand, we have this idea, I think, of a qualitatively distinct period at the end of a life, and on the other hand, a long-standing sense that no moment or instant is qualitatively distinct. So, for example, in the service for the burial of the dead in the Book of Common Prayer, we read that in the midst of life we be in death. And it's one of the oldest and most familiar of thoughts that any moment could be our last. To cite another authority, in his song It's All Right Ma, Bob Dylan says, "He not busy being born is busy dying." So the thought being that any moment might be our last, and the moment that will be my last is not essentially distinct from any other. And consider another case, perhaps a little more detail. In his Anthropology, Kant becomes increasingly fascinated by the quality of life towards the end of a life. And he talks about the multitude of stages that mark the last part of life with various and different tasks. And what these things can do is arouse in an old person, he's talking about the happier state where we're talking about an older person, it can arouse in an old person the illusion of a longer travelled lifetime. The more you have thought, the more you have done, the longer you have lived, even in your own imagination. Hence, he says, the conclusion of such a life can occur with contentment. So this sounds good. We can have a contented, if we're fortunate enough to survive long enough, to live long enough, a certain type of contentment is possible. But then he asks, what about contentment during life? And he says, for the human being, it is unattainable. Neither from the moral point of view nor from the pragmatic point of view can it be. Can we make sense of it? Because as an incentive to activity, nature has put pain in the human being that they cannot escape from, in order always to progress toward what is better. And even in the last moments of life, contentment with the last stage of it can only be called comparative. It's never pure and never complete. So to be absolutely contented, Kant thinks, would be a sort of idle rest, a complete idleness that was a sort of restful idleness, the standstill of all incentives, the dulling of sensations, and any activity connected with them. And he thinks no such state is compatible with a human life. Okay, so it's akin to the stopping of a heart in an animal body, he says. Now, this is a rather intriguing thought because it looks then that for Kant, even in the last moments of a life, right up to the end of a life, contentment or any condition can only be called comparative. It will have something essentially in common with every other moment of a human life. Now, there are various ambiguities in this passage, which in the longer piece I'll try and engage with. But for my purposes, I just want to focus on this thought that, as with the prayer book, as with so many other ways of saying it, the thought is that nothing essentially distinguishes the moment at the end of a life from any other moment. And it's interesting in the Western, at least the sort of Greco-Christian tradition, the two exemplary deaths, Socrates and Christ, are both represented as speaking right up to the end. So that both in the Plato text and in the Gospels, Socrates and Christ are talking right till the very end. Okay, so in some sense, these deaths, which in very different ways, as it were, are epitomized good deaths, are deaths of people who, as it were, own their life right up till the very end. So there's a sort of tension. On the one hand, we have a topic, an interest in something which seems to be an urgent topic for us. How are we going to think about this particular period, this strange period which medical science has made possible at the end of a life? And we have a tradition, a philosophical and religious tradition, which in some sense insists that death is in life. We are already, as it were, in the interval at the end of a life. So let me clarify the topic a little bit further by trying to say something about trying to unpack what I take to be Govander's claim, that this, you notice he said it used to only be a matter of days or weeks, and Now it can be a matter of years, so it's much more an issue for us. But I'm interested, as it were, in the philosophical or the metaphysical thought implicit there, that this interval at the end of a life has always been in place. That whatever it is, to live a meaningful life and to be someone who dies is to be someone who necessarily goes through or experiences this interval. And I have a couple of ways of trying to talk about this. I won't go into, one of the cases I want to talk about in the main project is the case of suicide and the tension between what it is that the person who commits suicide wants to do when they set in motion a process that might lead to their death and what it is they're able to do. So there's a sense in which the person who commits suicide wants to make it the case that now they no longer exist, as if they could, as it were, control the instant at the end. But that's not possible. There is always an interval. And there was an interesting case a few years ago of someone who jumped off a building in New York and then was blown in by the wind in through an open window, and although seriously injured, survived and spoke about regretting the instant they jumped, a feeling of terrible. Okay, so the thought there is I think quite a simple one, that there is always still time. So that, and I think if I had more time, I would probably try to show that it's got something to do with the I thinking of itself as both subject and object. So what I want to do as subject is kill myself, but there's no absolute coinciding between the subject who acts to bring about the end and the object I act on. It's something that is expressed beautifully and terribly at the end of one of Dostoevsky's novels, where of a suicide said there was evidence of consciousness right up to the end. So there's something there, the thought that even in something as quick, even if what makes suicide so terrible, the distress it causes those who've known people who've done it, is that terribleness of the interval, that it can't be controlled. And there was a film that Liz is here, that was shown at Fabrica a few years ago by Jordan Baseman, and he did an extraordinary film which simply consisted of a recording that had been smuggled out of a Georgia prison where someone was being put to death by electrocution on the electric chair. And all the work was a black screen with everything that we heard, everything that people said, transcribed so you could read it. And the title of the piece is just July the 12th, 1984. And what you hear is simply the process of electrocuting someone, killing someone on the electric chair. Now, in the discussion after this, and it was a rather tense, it was a difficult discussion because quite a few people, I think including myself, found it difficult to treat this as a work of art. It was, but one of the really interesting things that quite a lot of the things people said they found distressing about it, someone else who was there, who was from Sussex, Bobby Facides, said, all the things you're saying disturb you most would actually be features if this was a voluntary euthanasia. Because what's distressing you is it when things go a little bit wrong, we've got to, okay, it's just the time passing. So, of course, what distresses us about it is the fact that it's not voluntary, it's a death penalty, everything about that. But the actual detail was being aware of the time. There's still time. It's not, the end is not yet there. And so there's something, so now we're talking, it might just be a matter of seconds or minutes or a decade, but it seems to me that the interval at the end of a life is not just an occasional feature, it's necessary, it's built into what it means to be the sort of being who lives and dies. Okay, so All right, yes, I'll do my other little bit of evidence because this one does genuinely fascinate me. I don't know if any of you are aware of a religious doctrine, a very strange Christian doctrine that was developed explicitly in the 19th century, but has become very, very popular in the States, known as the rapture. The doctrine of the rapture, which has virtually no biblical authority for it, basically states that at a certain point before the final judgment, the true believers will be called into the air to meet God, to meet Christ. So it's a very peculiar doctrine. It's basically saying before the end, there'll be a sort of escape route for the true believers, effectively. But what's also interesting about this doctrine is that it's based on a text in Paul's, the first epistle to the Thessalonians, where it says that the people who are called will not die. Okay, so this is the crucial thing about the rapture, that when it happens, the true believers don't die, they just go straight to be with Christ. Now, if you're a true believer, one of the other things you believe is that when you die, you go straight to be with Christ, right? So if you believe in the rapture, you believe two things. Firstly, if I die, whenever I die, I will go straight to be with Christ. Secondly, if the rapture happens, I won't die, I'll just go straight to be with Christ. So now, looking at this, you might think, let's assume for a moment that the rapture, the doctrine's not true. So you wonder what's about that doctrine could provide any psychical comfort? What work might it do for the believer? Because on the face of it, it looks like, given that you think dying just is going to heaven or whatever, going to be with God, and the rapture's just going to be with God, what is the difference? Now, there are all sorts of ways you might answer it, but one of the things I wanted to suggest was what the rapture supposedly protects you from is the interval at the end of a life. So it's not... Okay, so what the rapture would do is, as it were, give you a now, give you perhaps what the suicide wants in the moment of the most desolate moment, a now that is no more time. But there's always still time, and the doctrine of the rapture is a sort of an attempt, as it were, even for a devout believer. So let's allow the sincerity of the believer to avoid that moment. All right, so I've mentioned attention. I've mentioned this thought that we're all familiar with, the sort of the cliche of that in the midst of life we're in death, and suggested that it stands in a sort of difficult relationship to this notion of the interval at the end of a life. And I've also suggested that that notion is, as it were, necessarily part of what it is to die. So one of the things I try to do in this project is look at various different ways in which the philosophical tradition, the Western philosophical tradition, has sought to think about death, to think about what a good death is, to think about how one ought to stand in relation to death, and try to show how, in certain ways, it has also tried to conceal this notion of the interval at the end of a life, perhaps through a certain moralizing about how one ought to stand in relation to it. Perhaps, okay, so I look at various versions, a Socratic death, a Christian death, a rational death, and an authentic death. And because Heidegger's been the focus for some of the discussion today, I thought it might be quite useful just to have a very quick look at Heidegger and what I think one can plausibly see as his attempt in thinking about death and being towards death and being in time to, in some sense, protect us from the interval at the end of a life. So for Heidegger, and this would have been perhaps a question to have asked Harvey, there is an interesting way in which one might say that the future is prioritized. Of course, Heidegger reworks the three traditional tenses into what he calls a sort of ecstatic existential temporality. But there's a sense in which for Heidegger, to be in the world is to be caught up in projects, to be concerned for the outcome of projects, for the meaning of those projects, each of which in some sense tends towards the future. So, as it were, at the heart of any present activity is a concern with that for which I'm doing it, that for the sake of which I'm doing it. So there's a not yet built in necessarily to any activity. And Heidegger wants to think, of course, the extraordinary significance death must have for a being who is effectively defining itself meaningfully in terms of it's not yet. Because whatever death is, it's the end of not yets. So Heidegger tries to distinguish his project, his existential ontological interpretation of death, from any biological or psychological or, very strangely, a theological interpretation. So that he wants to say that whereas biology treats death in relation to a defined end, an event, something that will come about that will leave a body, a corpse. What the ontological investigation of death does is, in some sense, think about our death in terms of its meaningfulness. So that is to say, it's not something that's ever going to be present at hand. So death stands before us, Heidegger will say, as something that impends. It's not a possibility. It's not something that I can, as it were, incorporate into one of these not yet projects. But what it is the possibility of impossibility, that the end of all possibilities. And it's one that can't be evaded. So if Heidegger's analysis is going to have to speak about Dasein in relation to its not yets, in terms of what's possible, everything that it's doing for the sake of, death is going to appear as the possibility of an absolute impossibility. So it's going to come into the remit of Dasein's concerns, but as the possibility of impossibility. And Heidegger thinks that when Dasein, as it were, grasps this or thinks this account or encounters death in a way that could be described in this fashion, then in some sense it grasps something that's true for it alone, because only an individual Dasein can, as it were, stand in relation to what will be the impossibility of all its projects. So that's why Heidegger says that death reveals itself as that possibility which is most my own, this Eigenster, which is heard in eigentlich, which is authentic. So Heidegger makes a distinction between fear in the face of demise or an end, the end of a life, the future end of a life, the event, and anxiety in the face of being towards death. And he insists that they're not to be confused. And he thinks that in our everyday discussions of death, we do so confuse them. We talk about death in a way that says, we might say in the midst of life we're in death, and we may well say that everyone dies, but we don't feel the existential force of that until it's individualized as the impossibility of all my possibilities. So we can distinguish, it seems, with Heidegger, between two senses of not yet. There's one which we can very loosely call inauthentic, because it's not my ownmost relation to death, which is explicable in everyday terms of the they or the one that Tanya mentioned earlier. And it's to do with the fear of dying, that event sometime in the future that befalls everyone, and the certainty of that end is a sort of matter for an empirical certainty, and it manifests itself in expecting a particular end. It's contrasted with a very different way of thinking about what's not yet, namely where it's not a matter of expectation, but of a sort of anticipatory awareness of the possibility of my impossibility. And this Heidegger links to anxiety. So here we have two accounts of a relationship to death, one which is deemed to be, as it were, the everyday, one which we can understand in terms of discourses such as biology or psychology or theology, where we're talking about a future event and the end of a life, and the other which is this felt anxiety at the fact of my own finitude, and then we have an everyday discourse which conflates the two, and so in some sense prevents. Anxiety is always experienced as a sort of fear. But now let's ask the question, what about the interval? Because it looks as if, for Heidegger, the experience of anxiety, the experience of myself in relation to my own being towards death, my own death, can happen anytime, at anywhere, and anywhere. Right? It's in the midst of a life. I can come face to face with, in anxiety, with my own being, myself as being towards death. So it looks then as if everything we'd call the interval at the end of a life would be purely sort of ontical interest. It's not significant. It makes no fundamental change to anything. But it raises the question of how can this medical technological transformation of an end of a life not have repercussions for Heidegger's ontology? That is, the idea of Heidegger reading Goende's thing and saying it's interesting, but it has no deep philosophical sense. It changes nothing. That strikes me as so I would want to try and answer that question by saying, because Heidegger has inherited and is developing mechanisms for not having to consider the interval at an end of a life. So that every moment, thought existentially or authentically, in terms of being towards death, is equally existentially and ontologically relevant. There is no existentially and ontologically relevant interval at the end of a life. Okay, so what time should we? If I finish at 5:30, is that all right?
Yeah.
A little sooner.
No, I mean just do as you normally would, and we can maybe have then the joint discussion.
Yeah. Okay.
Immediately after.
Okay. So one way to respond, and one of the ways in which some critics of Heidegger have responded, is to say, well, the trouble with Heidegger's project is that it focuses the relation to death as my relationship to my own death, so that in some sense the end of my life, just as much as this moment of my life now, is going to be caught up in whatever drama is going on at the level of anxiety, which is going to be my existential concern with my own death. So another philosopher who wants to take complete issue with this view, Emmanuel Levinas, says, no, the crucial point, he actually says that thinking about an inevitable death is not the philosopher's first thought. It's not the most important thought at all. Yes, it's true we're all going to die, but not yet. And the not yet, he means, is the most inauthentic not yet you could possibly imagine. Right? So Levinas would say that there is always still time to be for the other, to be for beyond my death, for a future that will not be mine. So it's very interesting to construe the interval at the end of the life in terms which have this Levinasian twist, if you like, But a consequence of that, and this is going far too quickly, would be that it too would remove from the interval at the end of a life what makes it distinctive, because it would deny that it's distinctive. It would say every stage of a human life, there is still time, there is always time, and that time that there always is and that always remains is ethically construable to be for a future that will not be one's own. So this seems to leave us with a challenge. We can either, in some sense, make the interval, deny that there's any specificity to the interval, make it compatible with the rest of a life and with the subject, self, or Dasein, whose life it is, and so insist on an underlying identity and continuity. I've tried to suggest that there are various reasons for thinking that's not the case, but we could do that. Or we could revise our descriptions and understanding of the world and our subjectivities so as it were, to admit of this interval. And so in conclusion, we might want to think about some of the things people say, some of the things we will say, the things we will hear said in and from the interval. Because it seems clear that if medical science is bestowing upon us years and years of this strange time between developing a condition and the end of a life, how are we going to, as it were, recognize it? How will it be represented? What representations will come from it? And that's why I wanted to close just by saying something about an interesting distinction between symptoms and works. Because there's an interesting tension in Kant's account of the end of a life. He thinks a living death would be idle, restfulness, doing nothing. But he does allow that you could have a sort of busy idleness. He uses that. And he has in mind sort of hobbies. He uses Tristram Shandy, Sterne. He takes the word from Lawrence Sterne. And what he suggests is that at the end of a life, if you've got enough money, you can spend your time doing something that looks as if it's serious but isn't really serious at all. This is a very odd claim for Kant to make, given what we saw him saying earlier about even up to the last minute, one is still, as it were, obligated, still caught up in the pain and the suffering that generates a concern for the good. Nevertheless, he does allow that in certain cases, when one's no longer productive, no longer, as it were, got a specific task at hand, one can invent non-serious tasks and treat them as if they were seriously. But this seems to beg another question, which would be, or to force another question. What would it be to take what is said and produced at the end of a life, in the interval at the end of a life, seriously, as works, for example, not simply playing at something, but making and doing something. And this is part of the project that I was involved in with a couple of filmmakers, that this fascination with trying to understand what is said, what is produced, what is made, the stories that are told, that come out of this interval at the end of a life. And the temptation is always the temptation of a symptomatology, to treat everything as a symptom. I have some pictures, and I'm pleased I didn't put them up because I feel uneasy about them, because when we're dealing with these sorts of works, there's always the sense of, is it a work or is it a symptom of dementia? Is it a work or is it a symptom of someone no longer able to speak or write? It's a problem that we have sometimes when we look at the things Kafka wrote when he was in the sanatorium, very close to the end of his life. Beautiful sentences, a bird was in the room. What do we do with that? Do we treat it as a work of art? Do we treat it as a literary work? What criteria are involved there? It's a problem, of course, in philosophy. What do we do with the work that comes out of Nietzsche's madness or something like that? So we're familiar with these sorts of limit productions and whether we see them as works or as symptoms. But it seems to me that this debate, this question, and the temptation of an ever-ready sort of symptomatology comes to the fore when we consider something like the interval at the end of a life. And I think, and this will be my closing thought, that people who are inclined to think there is no such qualitatively distinct and philosophically and ethically interesting thing like the interval at the end of a life, in some sense inclined to the view that these are symptoms. Okay, so you have an active, productive life, and we have, in some way, an implicitly normative conception of what counts as a work, as a useful production, or as an aesthetically interesting production. And to the extent that we have something we can recognize as that, then the person's condition, as it were, is not, they haven't, we're not going to reduce their rationality or claim there's any problematic status to them. But if we do think they can't be thought of as works, we'll treat them as symptoms. But I think one of the interesting and perhaps fruitful consequences of allowing that we've seem to have been given this notion of an interval at the end of the life is to think, well, what will we do with what is said and made and the fears that are expressed from that time and place? And I suppose the worry is that there are resources, I think even in Plato and in Christian tradition, for thinking about that, maybe in Heidegger as well, but at least in that dominant way in which Heidegger presents what it is to be finite, there's no room for an existentially significant interval. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. I took it that you alluded to the philosophical tradition that death is already built into life. So life itself is a life-threatening condition in that sense. And you kind of contrasted it to their more medical view of that there is an interval between recognizing that I have a life-threatening condition than actually dying or coming to death. And I was wondering what you would say to this new development in genetics where you could get a diagnosis of having a life-threatening disposition, for example, this disposition to breast cancer, that would be already then, I recognize I have a life-threatening condition, but it takes decades maybe until I die, and also I don't feel in that moment, I don't feel sick, I don't feel ill, I know I have a condition, but I was wondering whether how you would embed this kind of new medical development of becoming aware of having a life-threatening condition, how you would incorporate that into your approach.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, and I was thinking about that in relation to a friend who has lived for over 2 decades with since having a breast cancer diagnosis. So it seems to me that in those cases, I mean, there's not a sort of a hard distinction that I want to make, but it seems to me that the treatment and the way she interpreted the treatment was as something that returned her to life and the world. So she didn't accept it of herself that it, in some sense, consigned her to this interval. And I think it's not, in that case, I think it's not what Govinda has in mind with this notion. And I think that, so what we're sort of talking about, I suppose what I'm talking about in a way is a situation where, in some sense, someone has accepted it of themselves, that it's no longer possible, in some sense, to deny that they're in this period. But it's very difficult because I don't then want to make it look as if it's just going to be, you know, if you're mentally strong enough, you can sort of avoid it. Because I did want to say, I actually do think it's a structural feature of simply what it is to die. But it's an interesting question because it looks in those sorts of cases as if you could almost. Can you will yourself out of it. I'm not sure. I don't know. And it's certainly true that, you know, that if when they discover ways of dealing with Alzheimer's, that it will no longer be this. But there will, alas, be many other dementias.
Yeah, or you could also say it's not just winning oneself out, but it could also be entering door into dying. You know, maybe much too early than we would normally have enter that kind of interval you were talking about.
Yeah.
So, you know, it could go both ways.
Yes, yes. I mean, I suppose maybe I am interested in this, and I didn't have time to go into it enough, this sort of strange ambiguity between whether we regard something as a work or as a symptom. Mm-hmm. And I suppose in a situation where that ambiguity doesn't arise, so that in the case of the woman who's been diagnosed very early with very young, with breast cancer, who's going about nevertheless still with her job, with her work, with whatever it may be. In that sense, we don't have that quite yet, that issue.
Of course, I was very intrigued by that talk and interesting, but I was puzzled too, and I kind of lost focus on what you meant by the interval in the middle of the talk. At the beginning, I kind of was clear, and at the end I was clear. So what, I lost sight of what the interval was supposed to be an interval between. And I was puzzled because you also said that you assumed it was always there.
No, what I mean is that it's if I'm right about something like the temporality of suicide, or that. So here are the two dominant views, that when we're talking about death, we're talking about the end of a life, and we're talking about something that's not experienced, because it's the end of all experience.
And by the end of a life, do you mean like the run-up to the end? Or
No, that's...
Like the ferryman, crossing the threshold?
Yeah, right, the very end of a life. So what? Okay. And the other way we have is, of course, saying that in the midst of life, there is death. So that this end could come at any point. Mm. But we're still talking about an end. Mm. And what I'm interested in is, in some sense, something which is distinct from the life, where we are, as it were, caught up in our everyday concerns and happily not thinking about our finitude. And this interval, what it is to live with. So there's some very good examples. There's a wonderful moment in one of his journals where Simon Gray talks about the moment of diagnosis, and he asks the doctor how long, and he wants to say, how long will I have to keep taking these tablets? But the doctor immediately interrupts him and says, no more than 12 months. And he immediately says everything changes in that instant. Every single thing changes, because every day is, as it happens, he lives longer, but that knowledge transformed it. That knowledge turned the life into something he could no longer even, as it were, experience.
From the outside, it might be the moment when either the patient or the doctor think, look, we move to palliative care. Because medicine to revive you is no longer... Yeah. Yeah, okay, so no, I understand that, but then why then insist that interval, even if very short, is always there? Because surely there just are sudden unexpected deaths where people really are in robust health. And what's so shocking about them in a way is that nobody has time to adjust or even prefigure what will be what will be, like Joe McCartney's death, for example.
Yeah. One hopes.
One hopes what?
It was.
Well, yes,
I
that's
mean,
true.
that's
Of
it,
course,
yeah.
one doesn't know. But what I
Yeah.
meant, but it was very sudden.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and a massive stroke, right? So a massive stroke that hits you, and
Yeah.
just 1 second. Yeah, yeah,
So do you think there are? I mean, so do
yeah.
you-
No, okay, I'll allow that. Yes, that's right. That's right.
Excellent.
Yeah, yeah. But okay, so all right. So I'm not suggesting that it's always something that everyone experiences, but it's a structural feature of a human life that.
More so than ever.
Yeah.
Given gerontology and
Yeah.
population.
Yeah.
Absolutely. No, and I totally agree.
And that's what's really interesting about, and this is drawing on my own experience of looking after someone, but it's very interesting in the case of something like Alzheimer's, because at the moment where you in some sense stop diagnosing yourself as grieving and then think, well, what is happening? You suddenly are aware of learning to know someone who responds to certain tastes or sounds. There are certain repetitions. There's something, as it were, that's being said there, and it's very interesting to begin to think about how it's represented, what could be made from there, what sorts, and that's why it's very difficult giving examples. So there's some very beautiful examples of people with Alzheimer's writing, seemingly happy for it to be seen, but it's very difficult to know how to do with it. I mean, the example I use though is works that come out of madness. If we had time, we'd play two Syd Barrett songs, right? One, which is just a beautiful song about madness, and one which I find it impossible not to hear as just madness singing. And those distinctions are really interesting. But there's a sort of refusal to allow the thing. It's got to either be something where we construct our our diagnoses, or it's somehow something we can distance ourselves from and call it a work of art. But the interval doesn't let us do that.
Thanks. I found that really provocative, but also puzzling. So hopefully even more provocative when you solve my puzzle. Which is just why it has to be, for us to take it seriously, for us to take what happens there seriously, why does it have to be differentiated? Why does it have to have a special existential or ontological significance? Can't it be taken seriously as part of life, as with what Heidegger and Levinas say about the rest of life?
So you mean we could just sort of add a few paragraphs to Being and Time, which would say, of course, then we have these experiences of death as well. Sorry, I didn't mean that to sound like
I took the provocation to be for us to treat what happens there seriously, not just symptomatically, but for us to think about what the person says and does seriously. And I didn't quite get the connection of that to needing a different ontological consideration of that interval from the rest of life.
Okay, so the thought there, again, I was trying to cover too much. Just as, on one hand, Kant denies that there's anything qualitatively distinct about the end of a life from any other moment in the life, and to the extent that one is rational, and to the extent that one is human, one is still under an obligation, and one still needs that spur to concern oneself with the good. And I take it that Heidegger would say that to the extent that one is still Dasein, one is caught up in projects and has and manifests a concern for the meaning of one's existence, and is capable and is sometimes thrown up against the reality of it, of the meaning of its relationship to its own death as what belongs to it more than anything else. Now, I take it then that for both, when Kant does admit that there are some things about the end of a life which are a bit different, he just says, yeah, but okay, but it's just, if you're elderly and you're wealthy enough, you can you can have a sort of, it's a little bit laughable, he says, but it's nice, it's harmless. It's hard to believe he read Tristram Shandy if he thinks these things are harmless. but you know, you do get this sense that he's almost sort of saying, look, this isn't, the serious productive life in a way is over, but it's harmless. And I think Heidegger would have to say something like, I mean, a Dasein who was no longer capable of, as it were, connecting itself to the world, and it's not yet in terms of productive projects and things, is in some sense, it's hard to imagine Heidegger, I mean, I don't know, I can't get a sense of how a Heideggerian account of dementia would work. I think you'd see it just as an ontical fact. It follows from a certain, it's a matter for biology and you know, medical science. It just seems odd to me. It seems odd to me that the philosopher, more than any other who's concerned with the meaning of death, should somehow have produced a text that looks as if it's going to be invulnerable to any change in our technical medical understanding of what death is, because that's always just going to be the end of a life, which is not what we're interested in.
Okay, can I sneak something in? Maybe it's because he didn't actually care about death at all. As in, he says, I mean, the point is that he's interested in death insofar as it's a way to live.
Yeah.
Which means he doesn't actually really care about perishing or demise.
Right. So, sorry, Heidegger thinks that Dasein doesn't really care about.
I just don't think he's interested in death as an actual biographical occurrence at all.
Right.
So, because it seems like you're sitting between two registers.
Yes, well, in a way, that's the question. So here's the claim that what the two registers allow philosophers to do is, in some sense, push to the less important register everything that's problematic and puzzling. And
tiny comment, sorry, okay, sorry, I shouldn't do this.
no, you
Where
should.
he makes that really interesting thing where he's talking about the inauthentic treatment of death as an actuality. And he says that one of the things that we do is talk the dying person out of their death and back into the tranquilized world of everydayness. Now that suggests that if he was interested in doing something like philosophical anthropology, that he could account for an interval then. But he just doesn't want to, obviously. He's not going to.
No, that's right. That's right. But it still seems to me that so it looks as well. It seems to me that there's a transformation in what being towards death can mean if one concedes significance to this interval at the end of a life.
Yeah, it's temporality different.
Yeah. And if fear is fear of the interval, then that does have consequences for Heidegger.
Yeah, by now I have too many questions to put them into one, but I'll nonetheless try. I read something rather provocative on the internet recently, where somebody, and I forgot whom, was arguing that cancer is in a sense the best death because it allows you to say goodbye to the people around you, whereas dementia doesn't really, and a sudden death also wouldn't. So in a sense, this article was basically sort of claiming that even though we ultimately hope for the sudden death, for the others, this sort of saying goodbye would be better, which strikes me as not necessarily true. I mean, it's not clear that the others are enjoying the saying goodbye. It can be, as you pointed out, just a really, really prolonged grieving. But it's also not necessarily clear to me that everybody would prefer a sudden death. I mean, some people would perhaps themselves enjoy the saying goodbye, even if those whom they are saying goodbye to don't enjoy it as much. So in that sense, it seems really sort of quite difficult to give a kind of general response as to what would be a good death. But it seems somehow that the relationship to others would perhaps be quite crucial, and that's something that I find very interesting in this sort of contrast between Heidegger and Levinas that you open up, because it seems that with Heidegger we indeed somehow have the difficulty that he is thinking about death in relation to temporality, and then the thing that matters to him is that death is a certainty, and because it's a certainty anyway, the interval doesn't really matter as much because it just makes the certainty more of a certainty, and if we want to run away from that certainty, then maybe we still can, hard to tell. Whereas perhaps then Levinas might be in a better position to think about the role of the others in relation to death. But then we would perhaps come into the kind of dilemma that Harvey opened up in her talk when she said, with I think it was McIntyre, that childhood and the interval at the end of a life are the periods when we depend most on others. And this dependence, I think this dependence on others could indeed be perhaps one of the characteristic features of that interval, in a sense. But then the thought there was also that that is ultimately still something that holds for life as a whole, just that we are less aware of it, in a sense. So I just kind of wanted to ask what you think makes this interval ultimately so terrifying and how it relates to this.
I don't know. It raises a really interesting question as well, though, because you could argue that one of the things Kant does when he concedes that we do live on sometimes after our productive work lives, and then he says, so we could play. There's a sort of infantilizing. So it's not just that we think of childhood and the interval at the end of a life in similar ways. We actually almost use the former to interpret the latter sometimes. And so I'm quite interested in ways to sort of work against that, because that would in some sense mean that we wouldn't take seriously the things that are said or done, or the meanings that come out of that. There is a worry about a sort of implicit moralizing, and I think it's true. I sort of worry often that people who are very ill and close to the end of a life are sort of burdened with a sort of thought that there's something they ought to do. They ought to die well. They ought to, and there are really interesting traditions in what it is to die well, and Harvey mentioned some of the philosophical discussions of that going back to the Stoics, but there's this idea that in some sense the death should either be worthy of the life, or if the life has been particularly unworthy, it should be a bit like Macbeth's line, that nothing in his life became him like the leaving of it. So you should die in such a way that and there's a sort of interesting way in which these things are. The idea that a person should also be responsible in some way for their own death, I think that's a really interesting phenomenon. And it seems to me that once we concede something like this interval, that's going to get increasingly problematic. What do you do? What do you do for someone who's suffering from dementia, for example? You either infantilize them and say nothing they say has the weight of work any longer, or you say, well, they should still, in some sense, die well. I don't know what that means.
Okay, any other questions? Yeah. Okay.
But we should open it.
We'll probably maybe make this the last one because we're out of time.
Okay. It's more of a suggestion really, because what I took from your description of the interval when you talked about the suicide thing and the execution thing is the thing, like experiences of the interval have in common isn't so much that you depend on others, it's that you lose control. And then I thought about the historical look at the interval and how it's got longer now, but I think there are two reasons for that. One, that medical science has allowed the end of the life to be longer, but also because the sort of middle of the life, so to speak, is less full of risk because people's everyday existence is less dangerous, jobs are less dangerous, etc. And I guess a good way to incorporate the sort of developments in technology with the idea of the interval is to just say that, like, you gain awareness of the probability of death later. And I just wondered what you thought of that.
No, I think that's a really interesting, helpful comment. I think you're absolutely right about that. The fact that the reduction of risk also, in some sense, opens up the our moving towards this interval. The thing about the suicide, I suppose, I was just intrigued by the fact that I mean, my working title at the moment is this: there is still time. That there's time. There's a time you can't control. And you're absolutely right, it's to do with losing control. But there's something interesting about saying of someone, if they've lost control, if a certain speaking or writing is no longer possible, something, and it's in the interval at the end of life. This isn't a point about disability. It seems to me that it's very, something very odd, then everything they do becomes a symptom.
See the double bind there as well.
Yeah.
That's really,
Yeah.
no, I can't think of a solution.
Yeah, no, that's helpful though.
Okay, I think we're supposed to run till 6, so maybe it's a good time to wrap up. It seems like someone should say something like, we should eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, or something like that.
Yeah.
Anyways, just
tomorrow we don't die.
Yeah, good. Hopefully. But anyways, just remains.
Yeah, Tanya, and
so,
thank
a
you
round
for
of applause
doing
for our
that.
speakers as well.